"You are not allowed inside this building," said the security guard loudly, even though the entire board of directors was waiting for the man he had just stopped. The morning air outside Whitmore Global Headquarters carried the quiet hum of the city waking up. Commuters hurried along the sidewalk with coffee cups in their hands and polished shoes tapping against the concrete. The glass tower rose high above them, reflecting pale sunlight like a mirror of power and wealth. At the front entrance, a tall black man named Marcus Reed approached the revolving doors with calm steps and steady eyes. His coat was simple and worn from years of use, yet it was clean and carefully pressed. The security guard, standing at the door, lifted a hand before Marcus could even reach the handle. His name tag read Kyle Bennett, and his voice carried the casual authority of someone used to deciding who belonged and who did not. "So you cannot enter through this door," he said flatly. Employees nearby slowed their pace just enough to watch without appearing obvious. Marcus stopped, but did not step back. He looked up at the towering building as if measuring the distance between the sidewalk and the top floor, where the boardroom waited in quiet expectation. The reflection of the city shimmered across the glass panels behind the guard, making the moment feel strangely still. Before we continue, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the story coming tomorrow is one you cannot miss. Marcus lowered his gaze from the shining tower and met the guard eyes with quiet patience. "I am here for the board meeting," he said in a calm voice that carried neither anger nor apology. Kyle Bennett studied him from head to toe as if the answer were obvious. The suits entering behind Marcus flashed identification badges and walked straight through the doors without interruption. Their polished briefcases and expensive watches seemed to form an invisible pass that Marcus clearly did not carry. The guard let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "The board meeting is upstairs," he replied slowly, as though explaining something simple to a child. "Delivery entrance is around the corner." Marcus remained where he stood. The city breeze tugged lightly at the edges of his coat, and the early sun caught the gray, streaks beginning to show in his hair. "I believe they are expecting me," he said again with quiet certainty. A young receptionist inside the lobby noticed the exchange through the glass doors, but quickly looked away when the guard glanced back. Kyle Bennett folded his arms across his chest. "Sir, I do not know who you think you are meeting, but nobody from the board arrives dressed like that." The words hung in the air heavier than the traffic noise behind them. For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Instead, he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a single envelope sealed with thick cream paper. The guard watched with mild annoyance as Marcus held it out. The envelope looked ordinary, yet the name written across the front was clear and deliberate. Marcus Reed Board Meeting Invitation. Kyle Bennett did not even glance at it. He simply shook his head and pointed toward the sidewalk. "I said you cannot come in here." What neither man knew in that moment was that 40 floors above them, a quiet boardroom, had already begun to notice that someone important had not yet arrived. The envelope remained steady in Marcus Reed's hand, while the morning traffic moved behind him like a distant river of sound. Kyle Bennett did not reach for it. Instead, he leaned slightly closer and glanced once more at Marcus' coat, his shoes, and the quiet patience in his posture. The guard had seen thousands of people approach these doors during his years standing watch at Whitmore Global Headquarters. Executives, investors, consultants, politicians, and sometimes people who simply wanted to see the lobby of one of the most powerful companies in the country. In his experience, the people who truly belonged never had to explain themselves. They arrived in expensive cars or stepped out of private rides with assistants already holding the door. They carried leather portfolios and wore confidence like a second suit. Marcus Reed did not fit that picture. The envelope in Marcus' hand did not change Kyle's opinion. "Sir, I already told you the board meeting is upstairs and the people attending it are not walking in from the sidewalk without clearance," he said slowly. His voice carried just enough volume for nearby employees to hear. A pair of junior analysts slowed near the revolving doors, pretending to check their phones while they watched. Marcus did not pull the envelope back. He simply held it there between them. The cream paper caught the morning light, and the ink of his name stood out clearly. Marcus Reed. The letters looked deliberate and careful, the kind written by someone who understood the weight of names and rooms where decisions shaped entire industries. Kyle Bennett did not read it. He shook his head once more and motioned toward the corner of the building. "Deliveries and maintenance enter around the side," he said. The tone suggested the conversation was already finished. Marcus lowered the envelope slightly, but did not move away. "I believe you should take a moment to look at this invitation," he replied in the same calm voice. The wind stirred again, and the tall glass doors behind the guard reflected both men in a warped mirror of the city skyline. One stood in a pressed security uniform with polished shoes and a badge of authority clipped to his chest. The other stood with nothing but a worn coat and an envelope that no one seemed willing to read. Inside the lobby, a receptionist glanced toward the doors once more. She hesitated as if considering whether to step closer, but then returned her eyes to the computer screen in front of her. Kyle Bennett shifted his weight. His patience had begun to thin. "Look, sir, I do not know what you think is happening here, but if you do not leave, I will have to escort you away from the entrance," he said. The words hung heavy in the cool morning air. Marcus Reed looked past the guard for a brief moment at the polished marble floor inside the lobby. Employees crossed the space, carrying coffee cups and laptops, their footsteps echoing softly beneath the high ceiling. For a second his expression changed, not with anger, but with something deeper, almost like memory. Then his eyes returned to the guard. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I am here because someone asked me to be here." Kyle Bennett folded his arms across his chest. "That might be true, but the people who run this building would have informed security if they were expecting someone like you." Marcus nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the logic in the statement. Around them the sidewalk continued its morning rhythm. Cars rolled through the intersection and a city bus hissed as it pulled away from the curb. Yet the small space between the two men felt strangely still. Marcus glanced once more at the envelope in his hand and then back at the guard. "Very well," he said softly. "If you will not look at the invitation, perhaps you could call upstairs and ask whether the board is expecting a man named Marcus Reed." The guard laughed under his breath. "Sir, the board of directors does not take calls from the front door," he replied. His eyes moved briefly toward the security cameras mounted above the entrance, as if confirming that the situation remained under control. Marcus stepped back half a pace, giving the guard more room. The envelope returned to the pocket inside his coat. Then he simply waited. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He stood quietly on the sidewalk outside, one of the most powerful corporate towers in the country, while the man at the door decided whether he belonged there or not. Far above them, where the top floors met the morning sky, a long conference table sat beneath tall windows overlooking the city. One chair at that table remained empty, and several members of the board had already begun to glance at it with growing curiosity. Marcus Reed remained still on the sidewalk as the morning continued to unfold around the entrance of Whitmore Global Headquarters. People passed through the tall glass doors in steady rhythm, each carrying the quiet confidence of employees who belonged inside the building. Some glanced briefly at Marcus and the security guard before quickly looking away. No one wanted to become part of a moment that might slow their own carefully scheduled morning. Kyle Bennett checked the watch on his wrist and let out a small breath through his nose. The guard had already decided this conversation was finished. Yet Marcus Reed had not moved, and that quiet patience began to irritate him more than any argument would have. Most people confronted at the door reacted with embarrassment or frustration. They apologized, walked away, or tried to explain themselves in louder voices. Marcus had done none of those things. Instead, he stood with calm shoulders and steady eyes as if time itself was not something he needed to chase. Kyle shifted his stance and lowered his voice slightly. "Sir, I am going to say this one more time. If you do not leave the entrance, I will have to call additional security." Marcus looked at him for a moment before answering. His voice remained calm and respectful. "I understand your position. You're doing your job. But I am also doing what I was asked to do." The wind carried the scent of roasted coffee from a small cart across the street, and the distant rumble of traffic echoed between the tall buildings. Marcus glanced briefly upward at the shining tower above them. The building rose into the pale blue sky, like a monument to decisions made behind closed doors. For a moment, his gaze lingered on the upper floors where sunlight reflected sharply across the windows. Something about that view stirred a quiet memory inside him. Years earlier, he had stood in this same place wearing a different coat and carrying a different kind of weight on his shoulders. Back then, the doors of the building had opened easily for him. The memory passed across his face like a shadow and then faded. Kyle Bennett noticed the look, but misread it completely. He assumed it was the expression of someone realizing he had lost an argument. "Good," he said shortly. "Then we understand each other." He raised one hand toward the radio clipped to his shoulder, but paused before pressing the button. For a second, he studied Marcus Reed again, perhaps searching for some final sign that the man would turn around and walk away. Instead, Marcus reached calmly into his coat pocket once more and removed the envelope again. This time he held it a little closer, so the name written across the front faced the guard clearly. The cream-colored paper looked official even from a distance. The ink had been written with deliberate care. Marcus Reed, board meeting invitation. The letters reflected faint sunlight, and for the first time Kyle's eyes lingered on them longer than a passing glance. Still he refused to reach out and take it. "Sir, anyone can write a name on an envelope," he said. "That does not mean the board of directors invited you into their meeting." Marcus nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a point that could not easily be argued. "You may be right," he replied, "but it would take only a moment to confirm whether the board is expecting me." Kyle let out a short laugh that carried no humor. "The board does not confirm meetings through the front door," he said. "People who belong upstairs already know how to enter." Marcus considered the statement quietly. Then he slipped the envelope back in his pocket once again and folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Very well," he said. "I will wait here until someone inside decides to check." The guard stared at him, as if the answer made no sense at all. "Wait here," he repeated. "For what?" Marcus lifted his eyes toward the tall windows again. "For someone upstairs to notice that I have not arrived yet," he said. Inside the lobby, the young receptionist looked up again from her desk. Through the glass, she could see the two men still standing in the same place. Something about the stillness of the situation made her uneasy, though she could not explain why. She opened a message window on her computer screen and began typing a short note to the building manager asking if security had reported any unusual situation at the entrance. Far above them on the upper floor of the tower, the boardroom remained quiet except for the soft rustle of documents and a low murmur of conversation. One of the directors glanced again at the empty chair near the center of the long table. The seat had been reserved for someone important, and the longer it remained empty, the more the room began to wonder where that person was. The silence between Marcus Reed and the security guard stretched longer than either man expected. Morning light climbed higher along the glass tower of Whitmore Global Headquarters, turning the windows into sheets of pale gold that reflected the busy city below. Employees continued to pass through the entrance behind Kyle Bennett, each one stepping quickly through the revolving doors and disappearing into the polished lobby as if the sidewalk scene did not exist. Yet the tension between the two men had begun to draw quiet attention. A few workers slowed their steps before entering, pretending to adjust a bag or glance at their phones while they listened. Kyle Bennett noticed the lingering looks, and his patience grew thinner. The last thing he wanted was a small crowd watching a situation he believed should have ended minutes earlier. He straightened his shoulders and spoke in a sharper tone. "Sir, I'm not going to repeat myself again. You cannot stand here blocking the entrance. If you have business with this building, you need to go through proper channels." Marcus Reed did not move. The wind shifted again, rustling the edge of his coat, while the sounds of traffic echoed along the avenue. He kept his gaze steady on the guard and answered in the same calm voice he had used since the beginning. "I'm not blocking the entrance. People seem to be walking through just fine." A faint murmur passed through two employees standing near the door before they quickly stepped inside. Kyle Bennett felt heat rising in his neck. The calm response sounded polite, yet something about it carried a quiet certainty that made the guard feel as though the ground beneath the conversation had shifted. He pressed the button on the radio attached to his shoulder. His voice dropped lower as he spoke into it. "Front entrance requesting assistance. Possible trespasser refusing to leave the property." The radio crackled softly before a voice answered from inside the building asking for details. Kyle glanced at Marcus again before replying. Adult male refusing to move away from the main doors. Claims he has business with the board of directors. The words sounded almost ridiculous when spoken aloud. From the corner of his "I'm Marcus" noticed the young receptionist inside the lobby stand up from her desk. She walked closer to the glass wall that separated the interior from the street and looked out with growing curiosity. For a moment her eyes met Marcus through the glass, and something about his calm expression made her hesitate. She turned back toward her computer and quickly typed another message asking whether the security team had a record of anyone named Marcus Reed scheduled for a meeting that morning. Outside, Kyle Bennett finished his report and clipped the radio back to his shoulder. He folded his arms once more and studied Marcus with open impatience. "Help is on the way," he said. "It would be easier for everyone if you simply walked away now." Marcus Reed gave a small nod as if acknowledging the statement, but he did not turn to leave. Instead, he looked again toward the upper floors of the tower. Sunlight flashed across the windows far above them, and the reflection made it difficult to see anything inside those rooms. Still, he watched for a moment, as if he knew exactly which window belonged to the boardroom waiting above the city. Then his attention returned to the guard. "I am comfortable waiting," he said quietly. The words carried no challenge, only certainty. Kyle Bennett shook his head slowly. "You are waiting for something that is not going to happen," he replied. "No one upstairs knows you are here." Marcus considered that statement carefully. "Perhaps that is true," he said, "but they will notice soon enough that someone they invited has not arrived." Inside the building, the receptionist stared at the computer screen in front of her. A response from the building manager had just appeared. It contained only a short question. Who is Marcus Reed, and why is he still outside the front entrance? She looked up again through the glass doors toward the sidewalk. The two men still stood in the same place, exactly where they had been several minutes earlier. The calm figure of Marcus Reed remained steady while the security guard shifted his weight with growing frustration. Far above them, on the upper floor of the tower, a director, seated near the end of the long conference table, leaned slightly toward the chairperson and spoke in a low voice. "We're still missing Marcus Reed," he said. The chairperson glanced once more at the empty seat, reserved near the center of the table. For the first time that morning, a faint crease formed across her brow as she realized the meeting could not begin without him. Two additional security officers stepped out through the glass doors a few minutes later. Their uniforms matched Kyle Bennett's uniform, and their expressions carried the same quiet authority that came from protecting one of the most powerful corporate buildings in the city. The taller officer glanced first at Kyle and then at Marcus Reed, standing calmly on the sidewalk. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Kyle gestured toward Marcus with a quick motion of his hand. "This man claims he has business with the board of directors, but refuses to leave the entrance even after being asked several times." The two officers looked Marcus over from head to toe. One of them crossed his arms while the other shifted slightly to block the path between Marcus and the revolving doors. Marcus remained still. The movement of the guards did not seem to surprise him. He simply watched them with the same quiet patience he had shown from the beginning. So the taller officer said in a measured tone, "We're going to need you to move away from the building entrance. If you have legitimate business here, you can contact the company through the front desk or schedule a meeting through official channels." Marcus listened without interrupting. The morning sun had climbed higher now, and the reflection of the tower stretched across the pavement behind him like a long shadow. When the officer finished speaking, Marcus reached slowly into his coat and removed the cream-colored envelope once again. The paper had begun to crease slightly from being handled, but the name written across the front remained clear. Marcus Reed, board meeting invitation. He held the envelope forward just enough for all three guards to see it. "I already attempted to show this to your colleague," he said calmly. "It appears the board invited me here this morning." One of the guards leaned closer for a second and then straightened again with a faint shake of his head. "Anyone can print something like that," he said. "We cannot allow people into the building simply because they say they have a meeting." Marcus nodded as though he expected that answer. "That is understandable," he replied. Then perhaps one of you could call upstairs and ask if they're expecting someone named Marcus Reed. The three guards exchanged brief looks. Kyle Bennett let out a short breath and gestured toward the street as if the suggestion itself were unreasonable. The board of directors does not confirm meetings through the security desk, he said. They have assistants and private offices for that. If you truly had a meeting with them, you would not be standing out here explaining yourself. Marcus lowered the envelope again, but did not return it to his pocket yet. He studied the tall glass doors behind the guards for a moment. Through the reflection, he could see the marble lobby and the reception desk, where the young receptionist sat watching the situation unfold. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the keyboard, as if she were deciding whether to intervene. Marcus finally slipped the envelope back inside his coat and folded his hands loosely in front of him. I understand your concern, he said. You are responsible for protecting this building. But I was asked to come here this morning, and I intend to keep that commitment. Kyle Bennett shook his head with open disbelief. So you're standing outside one of the largest corporate headquarters in the country waiting for the board of directors to notice you. That is not how the real world works. Marcus looked up toward the shining windows high above them once more. The sunlight flashed across the upper floors where the boardroom overlooked the entire city. His expression softened slightly, as if he recognized something familiar about the view. Perhaps not, he said quietly. But the people upstairs are expecting someone, and that person has not arrived yet. Sooner or later someone will begin asking why. The guard said nothing for a moment. The quiet certainty in Marcus' voice carried a weight that did not match the worn coat he wore or the calm posture with which he stood. Inside the lobby, the receptionist stared again at the message blinking on her computer screen. The building manager had sent a second reply asking for clarification. Is the man outside still there? She glanced through the glass at Marcus Reed, standing on the sidewalk surrounded by security officers, and typed a short response. Yes, he is still here, and he says the board invited him. Far above the entrance, where the skyline stretched wide across the windows of the boardroom, the chairperson finally placed both hands on the long conference table and looked around at the directors seated beside her. We cannot begin this meeting until Marcus Reed arrives, she said slowly. And if he confirmed that he would be here this morning, then something downstairs must be preventing him from reaching this room. The tension at the front entrance of Whitmore Global Headquarters slowly shifted from irritation to quiet curiosity. The three security officers remained positioned around Marcus Reed, while employees continued to pass through the revolving doors behind them. Each person entering the building pretended not to notice the situation, yet many slowed their steps just long enough to take a quick glance. Wordless questions hung in the air. Why was this man still standing outside, surrounded by security? Marcus did not appear angry or embarrassed. Instead, he seemed strangely calm, as though the moment unfolding on the sidewalk was only a small delay in a much larger day. Kyle Bennett noticed. The growing attention and his frustration deepened. He had intended to remove the situation quickly and return to the routine rhythm of the morning entrance. Instead, the man in the worn coat continued to stand quietly, as if the passing minutes meant nothing to him. So the taller officer said again, with controlled patience, "We cannot allow you to remain here indefinitely. If you do not step away from the entrance, we will have to escort you off the property." Marcus Reed turned his eyes toward the officer and nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "I understand what you are saying," he replied calmly. "You have a responsibility to this building. But I also have a responsibility to keep my word." The officer frowned slightly. "Your word to whom?" he asked. Marcus glanced once more toward the upper floors of the tower, where sunlight reflected across the long rows of windows. "To the people who asked me to be here this morning," he said. Kyle Bennett shook his head in disbelief. "The people who run this company do not invite someone who looks like he just walked off the street," he said sharply. The words were spoken louder than he intended, and several employees entering the building paused for a moment before continuing inside. Marcus did not react to the remark. Instead, he folded his hands loosely in front of him again and looked toward the glass doors where the young receptionist stood watching. Through the reflection, he could see her hesitate before lifting the telephone on her desk. Inside the lobby, the receptionist had finally decided to call the building manager directly. Her voice carried a note of uncertainty as she explained the situation. "There's a man outside who says the board invited him. Security is refusing to let him enter, and he has been standing there for quite a while. Saw the same thing and sighed heavily. Now you have caused a disturbance inside the building," he said to Marcus. "That was not my intention," Marcus replied gently. "My intention was simply to arrive for the meeting I was invited to attend." One of the other security officers shifted uncomfortably. Something about the man's calm voice and steady confidence made the situation feel less certain than it had only minutes earlier. Kyle Bennett, however, remained determined to end the encounter. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Sir, I am giving you one final chance to leave before we escort you away from the property." Marcus met his gaze without hostility. "I appreciate the warning," he said, "but I will remain here until someone upstairs confirms whether they are expecting me." Kyle Bennett opened his mouth to respond, but at that moment the glass doors behind him slid open again. The building manager hurried toward the entrance with a phone still pressed to his ear. His eyes moved quickly between the security officers and the quiet man standing on the sidewalk. The manager ended the call slowly and looked directly at Marcus Reed. For the first time that morning, uncertainty appeared in the face of someone inside the building. He spoke carefully. "Sir, did you say your name is Marcus Reed?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, that is correct." The manager glanced down at the screen of his phone, where a message from the executive office had just appeared. Then he looked back up again with a growing seriousness in his expression. In that moment, the quiet sidewalk outside Whitmore Global Headquarters felt as though it were standing at the edge of a very important mistake. The building manager stood just inside the glass entrance of Whitmore Global Headquarters with his phone still in his hand, his eyes fixed on Marcus Reed, as if trying to place a memory that had suddenly surfaced. The three security officers turned slightly toward him, their posture shifting from authority to uncertainty. Kyle Bennett stepped forward first. "This man claims he has business with the board of directors, but refuses to leave the entrance," he said firmly. The manager did not answer right away. Instead, he looked again at Marcus Reed, studying his face more carefully than anyone had that morning. The city noise continued behind them as cars passed along the avenue, and a distant horn echoed between the buildings. Yet the small space near the revolving doors had grown strangely quiet. Finally, the manager spoke. "Sir, did you say your name is Marcus Reed?" Marcus nodded once. "Yes, that is correct." The manager lowered his phone slowly and glanced down at the message on the screen before looking back up again. For a brief moment, something like recognition flickered in his expression, though he seemed unsure why. Kyle Bennett folded his arms again and spoke with growing impatience. "We have already asked him to leave several times. He says the board invited him, but he cannot provide any verification." Marcus listened to the words without reacting. Then he reached calmly into his coat pocket and removed the envelope once again. The cream-colored paper caught the sunlight, and he extended it toward the manager. "I believe this might answer your question," he said quietly. The manager hesitated before stepping closer and taking the envelope. Unlike the security guards, he actually looked at the writing on the front. His eyes moved slowly across the letters. "Marcus Reed, board meeting invitation." The manager turned the envelope over and noticed the embossed seal pressed into the paper. It carried the official mark used only by the executive office on the highest floor of the building. His brows lowered slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the document inside. Kyle Bennett watched with growing irritation. "Anyone can print a letter," he said. "That does not prove anything." The manager did not respond. He read the document once, then again more carefully. The quiet sound of paper shifting in his hands seemed unusually loud in the still air. A few employees standing near the doors pretended to check their phones while watching the scene unfold. Finally, the manager lifted his eyes from the page and looked at Marcus Reed with a much different expression than before. "Where did you receive this invitation?" he asked slowly. "It was delivered to my office 2 days ago," Marcus replied. The manager nodded faintly, as if confirming something in his mind. Kyle Bennett shook his head and stepped forward again. "Sir, with respect, this could still be fake," he insisted. "We cannot just allow someone to walk into a board meeting because they handed you a piece of paper. The manager glanced back down at the letter in his hands. His finger traced the signature printed near the bottom of the page. It belonged to the chairperson of the board herself. He looked again at Marcus Reed, standing quietly on the sidewalk surrounded by security officers. Something about the calm confidence in the man's posture made the entire situation feel different now. The manager turned slightly toward Kyle Bennett. "Did you attempt to verify his name with the executive office upstairs?" he asked. Kyle frowned. "That is not our responsibility," he replied. "The board does not take calls from the front entrance." The manager drew in a slow breath. For the first time, the possibility that the building might have made a serious mistake began to settle into his thoughts. He glanced once more at the phone in his hand and the message waiting on the screen from the executive assistant upstairs. The words were brief but unmistakable. "Confirm immediately whether Marcus Reed has arrived." The manager looked back up at Marcus and spoke with careful politeness. "Sir, if you would wait here just a moment longer, I need to make a call upstairs to clarify something." Marcus gave a small nod. "Of course," he said. Kyle Bennett opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when he noticed the seriousness in the manager's expression. The manager stepped a few feet away and lifted the phone to his ear. As the call began, he walked back through the glass doors into the lobby, leaving the security officers and Marcus Reed alone on the sidewalk once again. Marcus returned his gaze to the tall windows above the city skyline, while the guards exchanged uncertain glances. Somewhere high above them in the quiet boardroom, the directors had already begun asking the same question that now echoed through the building. "Where's Marcus Reed?" Inside the marble lobby of Whitmore Global Headquarters, the building manager walked several steps away from the glass doors before lifting the phone to his ear. His pace slowed as the call connected, and the quiet murmur of the executive office answered from the highest floor of the building. The young receptionist watched him carefully from behind her desk, her hands folded together as if she already sensed that the situation outside had grown more serious than anyone expected. Through the glass door, she could still see Marcus Reed standing calmly on the sidewalk, while 3 security officers remained positioned around him. The manager spoke quietly into the phone. "This is the building manager at the main entrance. I need to confirm something regarding a guest named Marcus Reed." There was a brief pause on the line before a woman answered from the executive office upstairs. "Yes, we have been waiting for him," she said. "Has he arrived?" The manager felt a small weight settle in his chest. He glanced toward the glass doors again before answering. "He is here, but security has not allowed him into the building." The silence that followed on the phone lasted several seconds. Then the voice returned sharper than before. "Are you telling me Marcus Reed is standing outside right now?" The manager swallowed slowly. "Yes, that appears to be the situation." On the other end of the call, chairs shifted and distant voices murmured in the background of the boardroom floor. The assistant lowered her voice. "The board meeting cannot begin without him," she said. "The chairperson has already asked about his arrival twice." The manager closed his eyes briefly as the seriousness of the mistake became impossible to ignore. "I understand," he replied. "I will correct the situation immediately." When the call ended, he lowered the phone and stood still for a moment. The bright lobby lights reflected across the polished marble floor, while employees crossed the room, carrying folders and laptops, without realizing the quiet crisis unfolding at the entrance. Outside on the sidewalk, Kyle Bennett watched Marcus Reed with narrowed eyes. The guard's confidence had begun to fade slightly, though he refused to show it openly. The man in front of him had remained calm through every warning and every challenge. That calmness now felt less like stubbornness and more like certainty. One of the other security officers shifted his weight and spoke quietly. "Maybe we should have called upstairs earlier," he said. Kyle Bennett shook his head firmly. "That is not how security protocol works," he replied. "If every person who claimed to know someone upstairs demanded verification, we would spend the entire morning making phone calls." Marcus Reed said nothing. He simply looked up once more at the upper floors where sunlight flashed across the long rows of windows overlooking the city skyline. For a moment his eyes lingered there, as though he could almost see the room where the board of directors sat waiting. Then the glass doors, behind the guards, opened again. The building manager stepped outside with a different expression than before. The hesitation he had shown earlier had vanished, replaced by clear urgency. Kyle Bennett turned toward him immediately. "I assume you confirm the invitation is fake," he said. The manager did not answer right away. Instead, he walked past the guards until he stood directly in front of Marcus Reed. His voice carried a careful respect that had not been present before. "Mr. Reed," he said slowly, "I just spoke with the executive office upstairs." Marcus nodded slightly. "I suspected you might," he replied. The manager drew a quiet breath. "They're expecting you in the boardroom right now." For a moment, none of the security officers moved. The words hung in the morning air like a sudden change in gravity. Kyle Bennett stared at the manager as if he had misheard. "That cannot be correct," he said. The manager turned toward him with a calm but unmistakably firm expression. "Is correct," he replied. "The board has been waiting for him to arrive." The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire entrance of Whitmore Global Headquarters. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been standing since the beginning, while the realization slowly reached the guards who had tried to send him away. Above them in the quiet boardroom, the chairperson of the company had just stood from her seat beside the long conference table. "If Marcus Reed has not arrived," she said to the directors around her, "then something downstairs has gone very wrong." The words from the building manager seemed to settle over the entrance like a sudden drop in temperature. The three security officers stood motionless while the morning traffic continued behind them, as if nothing unusual had happened. Kyle Bennett stared at the manager for several seconds before speaking. "That does not make sense," he said slowly. "The board of directors does not personally invite someone who walks in without identification." The manager kept his eyes on Marcus Reed while answering. "They did not simply invite him. They are waiting for him." Marcus said nothing. He stood with the same calm posture he had carried since the moment he arrived, his hands loosely folded and his gaze steady. The wind moved lightly across the sidewalk and carried the distant sound of a passing bus through the narrow street. Between the tall buildings, one of the other security officers shifted his stance and glanced at Marcus with a different expression now. It was no longer suspicion, but uncertainty. If the board was truly expecting him, then the situation they had created outside the entrance had already gone too far. Kyle Bennett rubbed the back of his neck, as if trying to clear a sudden pressure in his thoughts. He looked again at Marcus Reed, as though seeing him for the first time. The worn coat and calm expression no longer seemed like signs of someone who did not belong. Instead, they began to look like something else entirely. Still, Kyle struggled to accept it. If the board is waiting for him, then why did he not identify himself properly when he arrived, he asked. The manager gave a small nod toward Marcus. "He did," he replied. "He told you his name." The silence that followed carried a quiet weight. Marcus finally spoke. "I did not wish to cause a problem for anyone," he said gently. "I only intended to arrive on time for the meeting." The manager looked at the guards with a steady expression. "The chairperson herself signed this invitation," he said. "The board meeting cannot begin until Mr. Reed joins them upstairs." The young receptionist inside the lobby had stepped closer to the doors now, watching the moment unfold with wide eyes. Several employees who had just entered the building slowed their steps inside the lobby, whispering quietly to one another as they realized something unusual was happening outside. Kyle Bennett felt the eyes of everyone around him and suddenly wished the ground would open beneath his feet. Only minutes earlier, he had spoken with complete confidence about who did and did not belong inside the building. Now that confidence had begun to crumble. Marcus Reed remained calm. He looked once more toward the upper floors where the boardroom overlooked the city skyline. Sunlight reflected across the windows like a quiet reminder of the room waiting above them. The manager cleared his throat gently and spoke again. "Mr. Reed, I would like to personally escort you inside the building, if that is acceptable." Marcus nodded once. "That would be appreciated," he replied. Kyle Bennett took a small step back from the entrance without being asked. The movement was subtle, yet it carried a meaning that everyone nearby understood. The man he had refused to let enter the building only minutes earlier was now being invited inside by the building manager himself. The other two security officers also stepped aside, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet unease. The revolving doors turned slowly as the manager opened the way. Marcus Reed took one step forward toward the entrance. As he passed the security guards, he paused for a brief moment, and looked at Kyle Bennett. His voice remained calm and respectful. "You are only doing your job," he said. Kyle nodded stiffly, though the words did little to ease the weight in his chest. Marcus then stepped through the glass doors into the lobby, where the polished marble floor reflected the morning light, and the eyes of every employee in the room followed him in silence. Above them, many floors higher, the chairperson of Whitmore Global had already pushed back her chair and begun walking toward the elevators, with several members of the board rising to follow her. If Marcus Reed had been delayed at the entrance, then they intended to see for themselves exactly why. Marcus Reed stepped fully into the marble lobby of Whitmore Global Headquarters, while the building manager walked beside him with a quiet urgency that had not existed only minutes earlier. The large glass doors closed slowly behind them, and the sound of the city outside faded into a distant hum. Inside the building, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations softened, and the sound of footsteps across the polished floor slowed as employees watched the unexpected guest move through the center of the lobby. The young receptionist stood straight behind her desk now, her earlier uncertainty replaced by careful attention. When Marcus passed, she gave a small, respectful nod, something that had not existed in the tense moments outside. The building manager gestured politely toward the elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. "This way, Mr. Reed," he said. "The board of directors is waiting upstairs." Marcus followed without hurry. His steps were steady and unhurried, even as the quiet tension around them grew stronger. Kyle Bennett remained near the entrance with the other security officers, watching the scene unfold from a distance. For the first time that morning, he felt the full weight of what had just happened. Only minutes earlier, he had spoken with certainty about who did and did not belong in the building. Now the man he had turned away was walking through the center of the lobby, with the building manager guiding him toward the executive elevators. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Inside the elevator, the building manager pressed the button for the executive floor. The doors closed with a soft mechanical sound, and the quiet lobby disappeared from view. For a moment, neither man spoke. The elevator began its smooth ascent through the tower, while the city skyline slid slowly past the narrow glass panel beside the door. Finally, the manager cleared his throat gently. "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding at the entrance," he said. "Security believed they were protecting the building." Marcus nodded slightly. "I understand their position," he replied. "Protecting a building like this requires careful judgment." The manager lowered his eyes briefly. "Still, the situation should have been handled differently," he said. The elevator climbed higher through the building until the quiet hum of the machinery became the only sound between them. When the doors opened again, they revealed a wide hallway lined with dark wood panels and large windows that looked out across the city skyline. At the far end stood the entrance to the executive boardroom, where several assistants waited anxiously beside the doors. The moment they saw Marcus Reed step from the elevator, their expressions changed from tension to relief. One assistant hurried forward immediately. "Mr. Reed, the board has been asking about you," she said quickly. They were concerned when the meeting could not begin. Marcus offered a polite nod. "I appreciate their patience," he replied. Inside the boardroom, several members of the board of directors had already left their seats and moved toward the windows overlooking the city. The chairperson of Whitmore Global stood near the head of the long conference table, her attention focused on the hallway outside the door. When the assistant quietly opened the door and announced that Marcus Reed had arrived, the entire room turned at once. The chairperson walked forward immediately with a calm authority that filled the room. "Mr. Reed," she said with genuine relief in her voice, "we were beginning to wonder what had delayed you." Marcus stepped into the room and offered a respectful nod. "There was a small complication at the entrance," he explained. The chairperson's expression sharpened slightly, though she did not yet know the details. "I see," she replied. Behind Marcus, the building manager remained near the doorway with an uneasy awareness that the explanation for that complication would soon become clear. Several members of the board exchanged quiet glances as they studied the man who had just entered the room. Many of them knew exactly who he was and why his presence mattered so much to the future of the company. Down in the lobby far below, the security officers still stood near the entrance, unaware that the quiet meeting taking place many floors above them would soon reveal just how serious their mistake had been. The boardroom of Whitmore Global Headquarters grew completely silent as Marcus Reed stepped farther into the room. Sunlight stretched across the long, polished conference table and reflected off the tall windows that overlooked the entire city skyline. Every seat around the table was filled with directors whose decisions shaped billions of dollars in investments and thousands of employees across the country. Yet in that moment, every eye in the room was focused on the man who had just arrived. The chairperson of the board stood at the head of the table with calm authority in her posture. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and her presence carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent decades building one of the most influential companies in the financial world. When Marcus entered, she stepped forward immediately and extended her hand. "Mr. Reed, thank you for coming," she said. "We were concerned when the meeting could not begin on time." Marcus shook her hand with a respectful nod. "I appreciate the invitation," he replied. "There was a brief delay at the entrance, but the building manager assisted me once the situation became clear." Eleanor Whitmore's eyes shifted briefly toward the building manager, who remained near the doorway. The manager straightened slightly under the attention of the entire board. A small crease formed across the chairperson's forehead. "A delay at the entrance," she repeated. Marcus spoke calmly. "Security did not believe I had a meeting with the board," he explained. "They assumed I had arrived by mistake." Several members of the board exchanged quiet glances. The words carried a deeper meaning than the simple explanation suggested. Eleanor Whitmore folded her hands together thoughtfully. "I see," she said slowly. The building manager stepped forward with visible discomfort. "Madam Chairperson," the security team did not recognize Mr. Reed's name. When he arrived, he explained carefully. They believed they were following protocol. Eleanor Whitmore nodded, once though her expression remained serious. "Protocol exists to protect the company," she said, "but it must never replace good judgment." Marcus did not show any anger toward the situation. Instead, he walked toward the long conference table where one empty seat had been waiting for him since the beginning of the morning. Several directors stood quietly as he approached, a gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed by the building manager watching from the doorway. Marcus placed his folder on the table before taking the seat reserved for him. The chairperson returned to her place at the head of the table. "Thank you all for your patience," she said to the board members. "Now that Mr. Reed has joined us, we can begin the meeting." One of the directors leaned slightly forward with curiosity in his expression. "It is good to finally meet you in person, Mr. Reed," he said. "Your work over the past several years has attracted a great deal of attention from our investment committee." Marcus nodded politely. "I am grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you today," he replied. Eleanor Whitmore glanced once more toward the doorway where the building manager still stood. She spoke quietly but firmly. "Please inform the security team at the entrance that Mr. Reed is an invited guest of the board." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, Madam Chairperson," he said before leaving the room. As the door closed behind him, the boardroom returned to its quiet focus. Papers were arranged and digital screens flickered to life along the conference table. Yet the calm professionalism inside the room stood in sharp contrast to the uneasy realization spreading through the lobby several floors below. At the front entrance, Kyle Bennett still stood beside the glass doors, unaware that the meeting upstairs had already begun. The weight of the earlier encounter continued to press on his thoughts. He replayed every word he had spoken to Marcus Reed and every assumption he had made. For the first time in many years working security at Whitmore Global Headquarters, he wondered whether he had misjudged a situation more seriously than he had ever imagined. The boardroom meeting moved forward with quiet intensity as Marcus Reed began presenting the proposal that had brought him to Whitmore Global Headquarters that morning. Large screens along the walls displayed detailed financial projections while the directors studied the information with careful attention. Marcus spoke with calm confidence, explaining the long-term strategy behind his investment model and the reason the board had invited him personally to discuss a partnership with the company. His voice carried across the room in a steady rhythm that matched the thoughtful silence of the directors listening to him. Eleanor Whitmore watched closely from the head of the table. She had spent years evaluating business leaders and investors from around the world. Yet something about Marcus Reed impressed her more than most. It was not simply the strength of his proposal, but the calm dignity he carried after the situation that had delayed him earlier that morning. When Marcus finished outlining the final portion of his plan, he stepped back slightly from the screen and allowed the room a moment of silence to absorb the information. One of the senior directors leaned forward first. "Your strategy shows remarkable foresight," he said thoughtfully. "Our analysts reached similar conclusions when reviewing your portfolio last month." Another director nodded in agreement. "Your firm has quietly outperformed several major investment groups over the past few years. That is not something we ignore." Marcus listened politely before responding. "I appreciate your consideration," he said. "My goal is to build partnerships that create lasting value for everyone involved." Eleanor Whitmore rested her hands lightly on the table before speaking. "That is precisely why we invited you here," she said. "Whitmore Global has always invested in people who demonstrate both vision and integrity." She paused briefly before adding with quiet emphasis, "And you have demonstrated both today?" The directors nodded in agreement around the table. The meeting continued for several minutes as they discussed the structure of the proposed partnership and the opportunities it could create for both organizations. Finally, Eleanor Whitmore closed the folder in front of her and looked directly at Marcus Reed. "Mr. Reed, the board would like to move forward with your proposal," she said. "Pending the final legal review, we intend to establish a strategic partnership with your firm beginning this quarter." Marcus inclined his head respectfully. "I look forward to working together," he replied. Several members of the board stood from their seats in a quiet gesture of approval. The tone of the room had shifted from evaluation to partnership. Yet Eleanor Whitmore's expression remained thoughtful for another reason. She turned slightly toward one of the assistants standing near the door. "Please ask the building manager to return here when he is available," she said. A few minutes later, the manager entered the boardroom once again. His posture carried a mixture of professionalism and lingering concern about the earlier incident at the entrance. Eleanor Whitmore addressed him calmly. "I understand there was some confusion this morning when Mr. Reed arrived," she said. The manager nodded carefully. "Yes, Madam Chairperson. Security did not recognize his name and believed they were following normal procedure." Eleanor Whitmore folded her hands again. "I appreciate the importance of security," she said. "However, it is equally important that our team understands who our partners are." She paused briefly before continuing. "Mr. Reed is not only an invited guest of the board today. He is also about to become one of our most important strategic partners." The manager felt the weight of her words immediately. "I understand, Madam Chairperson," he replied. "I will make sure the security team is informed." Eleanor Whitmore gave a small nod. "Please do," she said. "The reputation of this company is built on professionalism and respect. We must ensure every person who enters our building is treated accordingly." As the manager left the room, the board members began gathering their documents and preparing for the next stage of their partnership discussions. Marcus Reed stood beside the long conference table, looking out through the tall windows at the skyline of the city. The sunlight reflected across the buildings in the distance, and the quiet moment allowed him to breathe after the long morning. Far below, on the sidewalk outside Whitmore Global headquarters, the same glass doors where he had been stopped earlier continued to open and close as employees moved through the entrance, unaware that the man they had seen standing outside was now seated with the most powerful leaders in the building, shaping the future of the company. The meeting inside the boardroom concluded with quiet confidence as the directors gathered their documents and shook hands with Marcus Reed. Sunlight continued to stretch across the polished table while the skyline beyond the windows shimmered in the late morning light. Eleanor Whitmore walked beside Marcus as the other board members slowly exited the room, their voices carrying a tone of approval that had not been present earlier in the day. "Mr. Reed," she said calmly, "Whitmore Global rarely moves this quickly with a new partner. Today we made an exception because the board believes in what you are building. Marcus inclined his head with quiet appreciation. I value the trust you have placed in my work, he replied. Eleanor Whitmore studied him for a moment with thoughtful respect. What impressed the board most today was not only your proposal, she said. It was the way you handled the situation downstairs. Marcus gave a small smile. Sometimes patience reveals more about a situation than anger ever could. Eleanor nodded once before turning toward the hallway where the executive elevator waited. Come, she said. There's one more thing I would like you to see. A short time later, the elevator doors opened again in the main lobby of Whitmore Global Headquarters. Employees moving through the building slowed their steps when they saw the chairperson of the board step out, surrounded by several directors. Behind them walked Marcus Reed. The quiet conversation across the lobby faded immediately. Kyle Bennett still stood near the glass entrance doors where the morning confrontation had taken place. When he saw the board of directors approaching, he straightened instinctively. The other security officers beside him did the same. Eleanor Whitmore walked directly toward the entrance with calm authority in every step. When she reached the security desk, she stopped and looked at Kyle Bennett. Her voice remained measured but unmistakably firm. I understand there was some confusion earlier this morning, she said. Kyle felt the weight of every eye in the lobby and nodded slowly. Yes, Madam Chairperson, he replied. I believed I was following standard security procedure. Eleanor Whitmore gestured gently toward Marcus Reed, standing beside her. This man was invited here by the board of directors, she said. He is now one of Whitmore Global most important strategic partners. The words carried through the lobby with quiet clarity. Several employees standing nearby exchanged surprised glances as the meaning of the moment settled around them. Kyle Bennett felt his throat tighten slightly. I understand, Madam Chairperson, he said quietly. Marcus Reed stepped forward before the moment could grow heavier. His voice remained calm and respectful. You were protecting the building, he said. There is no fault in that. Kyle looked at him with visible regret. I should have listened more carefully, he admitted. Marcus gave a small nod. Sometimes the people we expect the least are the ones we should listen to first, he replied. Eleanor Whitmore allowed a faint smile before addressing the security team one final time. Remember this, she said. True professionalism is not only about protecting doors. It is about recognizing the value of the people who walk through them. The lobby remained silent for several seconds after she spoke. Then she turned toward Marcus. Shall we continue our discussion upstairs, she asked. Marcus nodded. I will be glad to. As they walked back toward the elevators, several employees stepped aside respectfully. Watching the man who had stood outside the building only hours earlier now walk beside the most powerful leaders in the company. Kyle Bennett remained near the entrance doors long after they disappeared from view. The reflection of a city skyline shimmered across the glass behind him while the words of the chairperson echoed quietly in his mind. That morning he had tried to decide who belonged inside the building. By the end of the day, he had learned that dignity and patience could open doors far more powerful than authority ever could.